So I think, as we've all seen recently, the Canadian Federation is a bit of an oddity. Canada doesn't seem to function like a proper unified nation state. And as the crisis of global capitalism deepens, and now with Trump's tariffs and the threats of annexation, the Canadian nation state has come under enormous pressure. And these cracks in the foundation of the nation state, going all the way back to Confederation, they threaten to become open fissures. And at times it can seem that there's very little that actually holds the country together. A Canadian humorist notably once said, clearly, if Confederation is to survive another 100 years, Canada must find a national spirit. Cohesion cannot depend indefinitely on hating Toronto. And so I apologize to any Torontonians here. I love the city. I lived there for 15 years. But the joke is funny because there is some truth to it. Because sometimes it seems that the only thing that actually really unites people in Canada is hatred for the big smoke. So in Mark Carney's first speech as Prime Minister in March of this year, after he'd won the Liberal leadership race, he said that Canada is a country built on the bedrock of three peoples, Indigenous, French, and British. And it's really incredible to me, actually, that this sort of thing actually even gets said these days. What's even more astonishing is that this sort of thing gets said with very little comment, in the corporate media or the major cultural institutions of the country. This myth of the origins of the Canadian nation state is simply accepted as fact. And Carney was actually praised in the media for saying this. And of course, there are people that can see through the BS, including many in this room, I suspect. But for many others, the myth of Canadian Confederation has completely replaced the actual historical facts. And so what is this myth of Canadian Confederation? The story goes that the visionary government of John A. Macdonald built a railroad from coast to coast and built a nation. And the act of Confederation is presented as a simple, happy union and a great exercise in peaceful, democratic nation building. But the fact of the matter is that the events of Confederation were surrounded by controversy, by strife, political violence, and it wasn't really a happy union at all. The standard line, at least initially, is that Canada is a nation founded by two peoples, the English and the French. But Carney has now turned this into three peoples to include Indigenous peoples. But it has to be asked, what role did Indigenous people play in Confederation? What say did Indigenous people have in Confederation? Well, the answer to both of those questions is none. By the time of Confederation, Indigenous peoples were completely excluded from the political process. And not long after Confederation, the historic oppression of Indigenous peoples was legally enshrined in the Indian Act. So for Carney to turn around and say that Indigenous peoples are part of the bedrock of the nation, I mean, it's insulting, really. And especially when you look at the crushing poverty that still continues to exist in Indigenous communities, or when Doug Ford just the other week had to apologize for his racist remarks towards the First Nations people of Ontario. What Carney said is actually really diabolical because it completely ignores the fact that the way of life of Indigenous peoples was totally destroyed and that Indigenous people were forcibly relocated and confined to reserves, forced into residential schools, and so on. But what Carney said is also insulting to francophones and the Quebecois people because it totally ignores the fact that the people of Quebec were conquered, subjugated, and forced into Confederation. And what Carney said totally ignores the fact that Quebec as a province to this day has not signed the Constitution of Canada. So what is the bedrock of the Canadian nation state, really? The real bedrock of the Canadian nation state is the British Empire, colonial capital, and homegrown capital. And this capital was able to flourish in what is now Canada based on the forced relocation and genocide of Indigenous peoples, the subjugation of the francophones and the Quebecois, and the ruthless exploitation of settlers and colonists, not only from the British Isles, but throughout Europe and the rest of the world as well. So capitalism, colonialism, exploitation, subjugation, and genocide. These are the real foundations of the Canadian nation state. Karl Marx once said that capital comes into the world dripping from head to toe from every pore with blood and dirt. And this is just as true in Canada as it is anywhere else in the world. So the origins of the bourgeois nation state are found in the classical period of the bourgeois revolution. So approximately from 1789 with the French Revolution through to 1871 with the unification of Germany. And the establishment of the modern nation state through the revolutionary emergence of capitalism was progressive historically. The overthrowing of feudalism, the coming to power of the bourgeoisie, meant breaking down the local feudal particularism, and it laid the basis for the development and expansion of the productive forces on the basis of a national market. And throughout this period of the classical bourgeois revolution, in order to overthrow feudalism, as in France, for example, or in order to overthrow the yoke of colonial subjugation, as in the case of the United States, the bourgeoisie needed to achieve certain things. And these are what can be called the main tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution. And that would include achieving national independence, a resolution of the national question, agrarian reform, so ending feudal land titles, opening the way for capitalist agriculture, the separation of the church and state, the establishment of bourgeois law as opposed to feudal or colonial law, the modernization of the economy, government, civil society, and society in general, and as well as democratic reform and the introduction of some sort of a democratic constitution. And the achievement of these tasks cleared the way for the capitalist class to come to power, to build a new state in their image and to defend their interests, and to establish a national market for the expansion of the productive forces. And it's the national market is the foundation stone upon which nations and nationality are built. Now, these tasks of the bourgeois revolution that I mentioned, I'm almost explaining them in a laboratory fashion from the perspective of pure theory. The most thoroughgoing bourgeois revolutions took place in the earlier period of the classical bourgeois revolutions, for example, the French Revolution. The American Revolution was rather thorough too, but it would take another 100 years or so with the American Civil War for these tasks to be really consolidated there. But in the case of France, despite the temporary restoration of the monarchy at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, feudal society as such was totally smashed. And the rule of the British Empire over the American colonies was also smashed in the American Revolutionary War. But history rarely unfolds in a laboratory-like manner. As Lenin said, those who expect a pure revolution will never live to see it. So we can see that in many, many countries, the bourgeoisie was able to come to power. It was able to forge a nation state without achieving all these tasks completely. And in some cases, the bourgeois democratic nation state was forged not through revolutions or uprisings, but by other means, reactionary warfare in the case of Germany, for example, or in the case of Canada, largely as a result of reforms from above. So the history of the birth of the bourgeois nation state is full of contradictions. Take the example of Britain, the first truly capitalist nation. Britain's bourgeois revolution in the 17th century established capitalism as the dominant social mode of production, but it didn't smash all the remnants of feudalism. Britain still has a monarchy, has a House of Lords, has an aristocracy with dukes and princes and princesses, and Britain doesn't have a constitution as such. But nobody would deny that the United Kingdom is a capitalist country, a bourgeois democratic nation state. The national question itself, the question of the self-determination of nations, is something from the perspective of theory that also should have been resolved by the bourgeois revolution. It was resolved in France, for example, but it was not resolved in the UK, where you still have the question of Irish unification, Scottish independence, and so on. And of course, here in Canada, there's the national question in Quebec. And though different in nature to Quebec, we have this potential referendum on separation in Alberta, but we'll get to that in a little later here. When looking at this classical era of the bourgeois revolution, this era of the foundation of the bourgeois nation state, you can see that certain patterns emerge. And you can see that in the early period of the bourgeois revolution, for example, the American and French revolutions, the bourgeoisie was truly able to unite the nation behind it, overthrow the old regime, and come to power. But by the mid-19th century, by the time the revolutions of 1848 broke out, you can see that in many places, including Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Italy, even Canada, that the tasks of the bourgeois revolution had become much harder to achieve. And actually, by the time you get to 1871 with the Paris Commune, the era of the bourgeois revolution is essentially over, and the era of the proletarian revolution opens. But in 1848, revolution after revolution went down in the flames of defeat. And there's a real contradiction here because the revolutions of 1848 were the biggest revolutionary wave in the history of Europe. But as Trotsky once pointed out, the revolutions of 1848 surprised one with their insignificant sweep. And with the exception of a few meaningful reforms in a couple of countries, most of the revolutions suffered a bloody defeat and achieved very few immediate results. Although it must be said that the revolutions of 1848 did eventually have a big impact, and they did clear the way for the eventual development of capitalist relations across much of Western and Central Europe. But in this period after 1848, the way the bourgeoisie established its dominance and the manner and the extent to which the tasks of the bourgeois revolution were achieved was different or distorted. So now the revolutions of 1848, they're a big topic. It's pretty complex, and I can't spend any time on the particulars. But we can look at some of the reasons for the defeat of the 1848 revolutions. If you look at the American and the French revolutions, capitalism was still very much in its early stages of development, and so capitalist class relations were also not as developed. And under these conditions, the bourgeoisie in the United States and France, they really stood at the head of the nation. The working class and the various sections of the petty bourgeoisie had either not yet evolved interests that were different from those of the bourgeoisie, or they did not yet constitute independent classes. The American and French bourgeois could therefore really unite the nation behind them. And in these countries, they were actually able to play a leading role in the struggle in the revolution from the liberation of the shackles of feudalism or colonialism. And often they did need pushes from another class. In the case of the French Revolution, the greatest revolutionary impulses actually came from the radicalized petty bourgeoisie and the sans-culottes. And they sort of served as a battering ram on behalf of the bourgeoisie. But the French and American Revolution succeeded precisely because the antagonism between the bourgeoisie on the one hand and the working class and other oppressed layers on the other was not sufficiently developed. But by 1848, this was no longer the case. Marx actually wrote a brilliant article about the revolutions of 1848 called The Bourgeoisie and the Counter-Revolution. And he explained the sort of earth-shattering nature of the English and French revolutions. He said, the revolution of 1648 was the victory of the 17th century over the 16th century. The revolution of 1789 was the victory of the 18th century over the 17th. These revolutions reflected the needs of the world at the time rather than the needs of those parts of the world where they occurred, that is England and France. But then Marx goes on to explain that the revolutions in 1848 were nothing like this. He said that the Prussian Revolution in 1848 was nothing like 1789, and that it was merely a faint echo of the revolution of 1789, and that instead of being ahead of its century, it was over half a century behind its time. And he explained that the German bourgeoisie had developed very sluggishly, very timidly, slowly, and that at the moment when it menacingly confronted feudalism and absolutism, it saw menacingly pitted against itself the proletariat and all sections of the petty bourgeoisie whose interests and ideas were related to those of the proletariat. The German bourgeoisie found not just one class behind it, but all Europe hostilely facing it. Unlike the French bourgeoisie of 1789, the Prussian bourgeoisie, when it confronted monarchy and aristocracy, the representatives of the old society, it was not a class speaking for the whole of modern society. So this explains in a nutshell why the revolutions of 1848 were defeated. This antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the other classes, including the proletariat, had already developed, such that the bourgeoisie became terrified of the revolutionary movement. Bourgeois revolutionary slogans about freedom, democracy, equality before the law, this activated the petty bourgeoisie, a petty bourgeoisie with radical democratic demands. And the bourgeoisie saw that these democratic demands, they saw them as a threat to its power, and they ended up siding with the reaction, with the aristocracy and the monarchs. The radical slogans taken up by the petty bourgeoisie activated the working class, which took up these demands in earnest and began to develop at least somewhat a political program of its own. And this political program of the proletariat obviously stood opposed to the interests of both the bourgeois and the petty bourgeoisie. So the petty bourgeois radicals in 1848, they were stuck. The only way to push the revolution forward would be to mobilize the working class, but this would have made the working class the dominant force in the revolution. And these classes already had antagonistic interests. So by 1848, the interpenetration of capitalist and feudal interests, the 1,001 threads connecting the capitalists with the feudal lords, rendered the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy inseparable and at times indistinguishable. So in 1848, the bourgeoisie turned to the forces of reaction even before having secured the conditions for its own political domination. This is why we say that the revolutions of 1848 arrived too late on the scene of history, but in another sense, we also say that the revolutions of 1848 arrived too early historically, because the working class had not yet had the time to form its own organizations, had not gained the experience of revolutionary struggle and cohesion necessary to carry out the revolution in its own interests. So with the revolutions of 1848, the bourgeoisie proved itself incapable of leading the bourgeois democratic revolution. So what you end up seeing is that many of the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution were achieved later on by other classes, by other means. So the best examples of this are maybe Germany and Japan, Italy, I think, as well, where the tasks of the bourgeois revolution were carried out not by the bourgeoisie, not by the petty bourgeoisie, or even the working class, but by elements of the old feudal aristocracy. In Germany, the main tasks of the bourgeois revolution were carried out through reactionary means by the Prussian Junkers under Otto von Bismarck, and it was similar in Japan, where eventually the tasks of the bourgeois revolution were carried out by a wing of the feudal landlords and the emperor. So what does this have to do with Canada? In Canada, in what was then the colonies of Upper and Lower Canada, so today Ontario and Quebec, you had the Revolution of 1837, 1838. This was Canada's bourgeois revolution. And just like the revolutions of 1848, the revolution of 1837, 1838 in Canada went down to defeat. But this was the most serious attempt at a bourgeois revolution in Canada's history, and unfortunately, it failed. But there is an important historical analogy here. It can be said that 1848 is to 1789 in Europe, as 1837, 1838 was in Canada to the 1776 revolution in the United States. These Canadian revolutions in 1837, 1838 were a faint Canadian echo of the epoch-making revolution that had taken place in the United States some 60 years previously. And so in 1837, 1838, the Canadian bourgeoisie was already reactionary, and like the German bourgeoisie, it had developed very slowly, and it didn't entertain the idea of revolution even for 1 second. Through 1,001 threads, it was connected to the ruling class of the empire in Britain, and the development of class contradictions in Canada already by that time meant that the radical petty bourgeois, the driving force of the rebellions in Upper and Lower Canada, was unable to unite the nation in revolutionary struggle. This is the historical significance of 1837, 1838. The big bourgeoisie in the colonies, the British merchants, the bankers, and so on, they established what became known as the Family Compact in Upper Canada and the Chateau Clique in Lower Canada. And to this day, the members of the ruling class of Canada come from these cliques, going all the way back to the 1830s. And similar ruling class cliques existed in all the British North American colonies. They were loyal to the Crown, loyal to the British Empire. They were very, very hostile to the idea of republican democracy. And these cliques assumed near absolute power in the colonies by purchasing land, building massive estates on huge tracts of land. They acquired colonial and noble titles. And the core of these cliques consolidated their power through appointments to the executive and legislative councils, which were unelected and appointed by the Crown. And they were unaccountable to the elected legislative assemblies that functionally had no power. So when the rebellions of 1837, 1838 break out, the big bourgeoisie in the Canadian colonies was totally reactionary. They had no interest in the revolution, and that's because their needs and their interests were already met in the current colonial setup. The ruling class cliques derived their power, wealth, and privileges from their position in the colonial trade. So they were determined to defend that colonial setup. And from the perspective of this big bourgeoisie, the completion of the tasks of the bourgeois revolution wouldn't bring them to power, it would actually overthrow them from power. They controlled the colonial government, controlled the banks, controlled the courts, they owned most of the land. But for the petty bourgeoisie, for the lawyers, the teachers, the doctors, and so on, it was a totally different matter. This layer of society was very sensitive to the ever-growing contradictions in society. The colonial setup had become an immense barrier to the development of the productive forces in the colonies. Capitalism was developing, but there was a need for proper government, proper ministries, institutions, proper infrastructure like roads for trade. There was a need for a proper legal and judicial system, a need for proper schools, education system, proper taxation and accounting of public spending. so on and so forth. So throughout the 1830s, you have reform movements emerging in all the British North American colonies, and they were called the reformers, and they really were reformists, at least the leadership was. But there was a real struggle for reform in the colonies in favor of genuine bourgeois democracy. The reformers, they drew up many different demands. At one point, they had a list of 92 demands. But the five main demands were an elected executive and legislative branches of government, control of provincial revenues by the legislature, the independence of the judiciary, equal rights for all religions, and complete separation of church and state, and also the demand for free trade became increasingly important. So these demands of the colonial reformers were the basic political program of bourgeois democracy, of the bourgeois revolution. They were demands for the free development of capitalist relations. And most of the leaders of the reform movement were opposed to the idea of revolution. Nonetheless, the struggle taking shape was the political expression of an emerging capitalist system in revolt against the straitjacket of the colonial system that was in place. So the development of capitalism in Canada actually required the overthrow of this colonial system, just as it had in the United States some 60 years previously. And over the course of the 1830s, the reformers began to increasingly win seats in the powerless elected assemblies, and there was a near constant agitation for democratic and economic reforms. And over the course of the 1830s, things were heading towards a logical conclusion of the situation. The reformers were heading down the road of revolution and the struggle for independence of the colonies, whether they wanted it or not. And you have to remember that the British Empire had never yielded an inch anywhere in the world without a fierce fight, and it would be no different in the Canadian colonies. The empire wasn't about to hand out democracy in the Canadian colonies as a gift, and in fact, between the ruling class cliques, the unelected colonial governments, and the British government in London, the reforms proposed by the reform movement were totally ignored or were quashed outright. So there's this pressure that's continuing to build in the colonies, this pressure created by the contradiction between the developing capitalist economic base of the colonies and the colonial superstructure that acted as a brake on the development of the productive forces. And this pressure continued to build until you finally had the revolutionary uprisings in 1837, 1838. But there was a fatal flaw in the uprising in Upper and Lower Canada. The leadership of the revolution was divided between moderates and radicals, between reformists and revolutionaries. And there was armed conflicts in the insurrection in Lower Canada in particular. And the Patriots, the Patriotes, they even scored some early victories against the British forces. But hesitation, some political confusion, and constant division amongst the leaders meant overall a poor leadership of the rebellions. And this meant that eventually the revolution was crushed before it even had time to organize a real insurrection. And the leadership really was severely lacking. Good leadership is an absolute necessity. It quite often does and can make the difference between victory and defeat. And so in Upper Canada, you have these kind of amateur preparations and organization, and ultimately the betrayal of certain elements of the leadership, and this shipwrecked the revolution. And in Lower Canada, the leadership of the Patriots was radicalized over the years, but they never prepared for an armed conflict with the colonial government or the empire. And even when this happened, the Patriot troops remained on the defensive without any real plans to go on the offensive. But the early victories of the Patriots in Lower Canada proved that they could defeat the British forces if they had been prepared in advance by a leadership that understood the necessity of an armed uprising. I think there was a possibility during this revolution for the Patriots to have installed a new Republican government in Lower Canada, a true bourgeois democratic nation state, and the impact of this would have been immense on Upper Canada and the other Canadian colonies at the time. And I think it would have been possible to establish a genuine democratic republic across all these colonies, independent from the empire. But unfortunately, this didn't happen. I remember a few years ago, I had given a presentation on the history of indigenous resistance in Canada at a school in Montreal. And we had some American comrades who had attended. And after the presentation, one of the American comrades, he approached me and he explained that he wasn't very familiar with Canadian history, which is fair enough. And he was curious about when Canada had had its bourgeois revolution. He was curious about how Canada had become independent from Britain. So I explained briefly that Canada never actually had a bourgeois revolution, and that the only real attempt had failed, and that Canada as a nation was actually founded through a series of reforms, and finally the Act of Confederation in 1867, all with the approval of the British Empire. And he was really shocked when I told him that Canada didn't become a truly independent country until 1982, when the Constitution was patriated from Britain, and that it was only from that point on that changes to the Canadian Constitution didn't require the approval of the British government. But he said something interesting. He mentioned that this made him wonder if Rosa Luxemburg was wrong when she said that every legal constitution is the product of a revolution. And at first I thought, maybe he's got a point, that, the history of Canada would seem to show that maybe Rosa had overstated things. But eventually I kind of came to think of it a bit differently, that the foundation of Canada as a bourgeois nation state was not the direct product of these revolutions, but the failed revolution of 1837, 1838 still led to the foundation of the Canadian nation state, even if indirectly. And it was the fear of another revolution. It was the fear of the total loss of the Canadian colonies to revolution that eventually led the British Crown and the Canadian colonial governments, the ruling class cliques, to accept democratic reforms. And these reforms would eventually establish bourgeois democratic government in the Canadian colonies. And like in Europe, where the revolutions of 1848 failed, but paved the way for the eventual development of capitalism and the eventual achievements of some of the main tasks of the bourgeois revolution, the Canadian Revolution of 1838, 38 paved the way for at least the partial completion of some of the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution in Canada. And so these tasks of the revolution were not carried out by the bourgeoisie. They weren't achieved in Canada through revolution or war, and it wasn't really driven by an intense rise in national consciousness. These tasks were achieved in Canada through reforms, fought mostly by the petty bourgeoisie and accepted or implemented from above in order to prevent revolution from below. And because of this peculiar path of carrying out the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution in Canada, there are certain distortions in the Canadian nation state. And so like many other colonial or semi-colonial countries, or other countries where the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution were carried out in historically unique ways, these tasks were carried out in Canada in a partial and incomplete way. Canada, of course, is no longer a British colony, but the reforms in the latter half of the 19th century were incomplete, and so were the constitutional reforms of the 1980s. Canada never became a true bourgeois democratic republic. The British monarch is still the head of the state. And in a whole number of different ways, you can see that the transformation of Canada from a semi-colonial country into a bourgeois nation state was achieved in a partial sort of distorted way. And it's these peculiarities, these distortions in the Canadian nation state that are the cracks in the foundation that are being exposed today in this era of the crisis of global capitalism. So the great myth of Canadian Confederation also says that Canada was built peacefully as a nation through orderly negotiations and legislations, a peace order, good governance, and all that stuff. And while this is largely true, it's not entirely true. It is true that in the wake of the 1837, 1838 rebellions, that democratic reforms, the introduction of a responsible government, was done mostly peacefully in the British North American colonies. Responsible government was first achieved in Nova Scotia in 1848. And the main reformer, Joseph Howe, he proudly said that the colony had achieved responsible government without a blow struck or a pane of glass broken. And this was largely true in Nova Scotia, although he had been challenged to a duel, and apparently they didn't shoot directly at each other. That's how they avoided killing each other. But throughout the British North American colonies after 1837 and 1838, the reformers just came to, they dominated the elected legislative assemblies. They were continuing to agitate for their democratic reforms, and they did become the dominant political force, such that the reform leaders were eventually invited onto the unelected executive and legislative councils, and this was usually an attempt to mollify them or to bribe them, but it didn't really work. And eventually the reformers in the various colonies won responsible government as a concession from the British Crown. But there was still, intense political fights, and these reformers continued to face some pretty hefty opposition from the ruling cliques. The various family compacts in the colonies after Nova Scotia was granted after Nova Scotia was granted responsible government in 1848, responsible government was won as a reform in Prince Edward Island in 1851, New Brunswick in 1854, and then Newfoundland in 1855. British Columbia, for example, would only be granted responsible government when it joined the Confederation in 1871, and this was more or less achieved peacefully in these colonies. But it was a bit of a different story in the province of Canada. This was Canada West, Canada East, so this is Ontario and Quebec today. The reformers were dominant in the assembly there. And in 1848, the newly installed governor, he acquiesced essentially to responsible government. And this was after a very long struggle and not a small amount of violence from the Orange Order, who were essentially the thugs of the family compact. But responsible government was put to a big test in 1849 when the reform government in the province of Canada passed what was called the Rebellion Losses Bill. And so this was basically a compensation package for people who had damaged property in the Revolution, and it was mostly going to pay people who had had their property damaged by the British Army. So this outraged the ruling clique, the loyalist Anglophones, the Orangemen, and they all saw it as basically giving money to the rebels. So after the bill was passed, the Orangemen and so on, they fully expected the governor or even the British Crown to veto the bill, but the governor, he gave it royal assent, and a while later the British government refused to interfere. So when the governor granted the bill royal assent, loyalists and Orangemen reactionaries, they went to his house, they attacked him, they beat the crap out of him, they pelted him with rocks and rotten eggs. They then proceeded to riot for a couple of days. They were beating up anybody that was suspected of being a reformer. They vandalized pro-reform newspaper buildings. They even went to the Parliament building in Montreal and burnt it down. So that's actually the only time in the history of the British Empire and the Commonwealth that citizens burned down their parliamentary buildings in protest. But there are actually a few things to consider here. The British Crown didn't just grant democratic reform out of the goodness of their hearts. There was a consistent struggle for reform. And the British Crown understood that at a certain point, if they didn't grant these reforms, there would be revolution. But there were also important changes taking place within the empire that helped to lead to the granting of these democratic reforms. British capitalism itself was changing. The industrial capitalists were becoming the dominant force versus the old financial and mercantile bourgeoisie. And in 1846, under the pressure of rapid industrialization, Britain repealed the Corn Laws, and the empire was now moving towards free trade. So there was less pressure on the empire to control the internal politics of its most developed colonies. The British Empire at this time was arguably at its most powerful, but it was already showing signs that it was bloated, it was decadent. And the British knew that they couldn't really compete with the United States and North America. The US was advancing very rapidly. It was expanding to the west, to the south, eventually started expanding to the north. And the British North American colonies, what is now Canada, they were lagging behind to a considerable degree. So in the 1840s, the US population was something like 17 million, but the British North American colonies, Canada, it was only around 2.5 million. And the American state, the American economy, was just also much more advanced. And the British Empire just couldn't keep up. Maintaining the empire was getting very expensive. The amount of resources required to maintain and defend the North American colonies was getting too big. And so the British came up with a solution that seemed to solve a number of these problems at the same time. The idea was to make the Canadian colonies responsible for their own affairs, for their own defense, but to keep them as a part of the empire. And through the monarchy, through the British Parliament, the Empire would maintain a legislative, diplomatic, and legal control over the colonies, but they'd be more or less responsible for themselves. So this brings us to Confederation. Canada as a nation state was not born as a direct product of revolution. There's no sweeping rise in national consciousness. Confederation was implemented from above as a piece of legislation to protect the interests of the British Empire, to protect the interests of the ruling class in the British North American colonies, and to defend from the rising power of the United States. And it was fear of annexation by the United States that was really the driving factor behind Confederation. The American Civil War had just ended. There was a bill proposed in the US House of Representatives to annex Canada. The Union Army was around 1 million men, something like that, which was about a third of the Canadian population. There was also a trade deal that the Canadian colonies had demanded Britain implement or negotiate with the Americans after Canadians lost the guaranteed access to the British market. And the Americans had rescinded this after the Civil War because they were trying to punish the British for supporting the South. And also the deal was just way more favorable for the Canadian ruling class than it was for the Americans. So this was also a big impetus because the idea was that if you can create a larger domestic market, you might be able to offset the losses from losing free trade with the Americans. And eventually, too, the Americans purchased Alaska from Russia in March 1867. So this sandwiches now British Columbia between American territories to the north and the south. So the newly founded Canada very quickly buys Rupert's Land from Hudson's Bay, and they welcome BC into Confederation a few years later with the promise of a railroad. You also, in the mid-1860s, you had the Fenian raids, which also caused some panic and was an impetus behind Confederation. The Fenians wanted to seize territory in the British North American colonies in the hopes that they could trade these lands for Irish independence. The raids didn't amount to very much, but in the British North American colonies, it wasn't clear like how involved the US government was. And this helped to create a real sense of fear about a potential US invasion. And nobody had forgotten that in the 1840s, the United States had expanded very rapidly by invading Mexico and annexing California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, as well as Arizona and Colorado. So in this situation, a US invasion of the British North American colonies couldn't be entirely ruled out after the American Civil War. So the empire wants to consolidate its colonies, and the first real move towards Confederation was the Charlottetown Conference. And it was initially supposed to be just a meeting of the maritime colonies to discuss a maritime union. It didn't include Newfoundland because, to be honest, they were never really interested in joining Canada, even in 1949 when it happened. And at a certain point, the co-premiers of the province of Canada, so what is today Ontario and Quebec, they asked if they could attend. And so this changed the discussion from one of a maritime union into one about all the colonies present uniting into a federation. So eventually you have a couple of other conferences, the Quebec Conference and the London Conference. And eventually the British North American Act was agreed by the colonial governments. It was passed by the British government. Queen Victoria thanked everybody for their loyalty to the crown. And the colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Canada East and West would together form the Dominion of Canada on July 1st, 1867. But at the end of the day, Confederation was still only a partial completion of these tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution. Canada gained a bit more autonomy from Britain, but it still wasn't fully independent. Britain still controlled foreign policy. The highest court was still a judicial committee in London, and the Constitution could only be amended in Westminster. So one of the most important things to note, I think, is the fact that there was never any kind of vote on Confederation in the colonies. The question of Confederation was never put to the popular vote. There was no referendum or anything like that. And in fact, at the Quebec Conference, the delegates had discussed putting the question of Confederation to the popular vote, but opposition to Confederation was so widespread in all the colonies, with maybe the exception of Canada West, that they were convinced they would lose. So instead, they decided the Confederation would only be voted on in the colonial legislatures, where at the time the pro-Confederation parties had majorities. So the initial establishment of the Canadian bourgeois democratic nation state, was achieved through rather undemocratic means. It was imposed from above. In Canada East, or what is Quebec today, you had something called the Red Party, the Parti Rouge. They were very much inspired by the revolutions of 1848. They were Republicans. They were agitating for land reform, and they were actually in favor of annexation to the United States. And there was intense opposition to Confederation, and the vote actually barely passed by 6 votes, I think. In New Brunswick, there was significant opposition. The majority of people were opposed. The big majority in the legislature was also opposed. And I'm sure that if things had continued this way, New Brunswick would not have joined Confederation in 1867. But what happened was, in 1866, there was a Fenian raid. It kind of put the fear of God into everybody, and the support for Confederation kind of kicked off after there, and it eventually did pass in the ledge. In Nova Scotia, there was intense opposition. In fact, there was a snap election in 1867, just before Confederation was supposed to come in. And the Anti-Confederation Party won 36 of the 38 seats in the ledge, and but they wouldn't actually come to power until September 1867. And the outgoing government, despite the result of the election and despite the clear opposition to Confederation, the outgoing government used its majority to pass the terms of Confederation in the ledge. So there were big demonstrations in Halifax. The premier was burnt in effigy. And in the first Canadian federal election after Confederation, the Anti-Confederation Party won 18 out of Nova Scotia's 19 federal seats. And so over the next few years, the leader, this is Joseph Howe, he was the guy who brought in responsible government. He would go to London twice, actually, to appeal to Queen Victoria to either rescind Confederation or to allow Nova Scotia to leave. He was ignored, basically. PEI is also very interesting, don't have time to go into that, but this was all actually bound up with resolving the agrarian reform. There was still feudal land conditions in PEI. British Columbia as well, this is very interesting, don't have a lot of time, but they were promised a railroad. 5 years, they were supposed to have it started within 2 years, finished within 10. 5 or 6 years after they joined Confederation, there's no work being done on the railroad. So actually a separatist party came to power in the government. They passed a motion demanding separation from Canada and actually sent it to Queen Victoria. So John A. Macdonald, there was a fire lit under his ass, and he quickly got the railroad built, and support for separation died down. You have the western provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. They ended up joining Confederation twice, first as a colony, then as provinces, and they didn't have a say either time, except in Manitoba, where there was an uprising instead of a referendum. But today, what are today the western provinces, they joined as a colony, so this was the Rupert's Land Purchase. Canada bought the territory of Rupert's Land and didn't even bother to inform the people there that they were going to be joining Canada. So this sparked the Red River Uprising, which led to the formation of a provisional government, and the people of Rupert's Land, under the leadership of Louis Riel, they demanded the right to decide if they wanted to join Canada, and if they did decide to join Canada, they wanted provincial status and not to be annexed as a colony. And it's interesting, in the uprising, the Red River Uprising, all the elements of a bourgeois democratic revolution were present, but unfortunately Riel and the leadership of the uprising, they agreed to a fairly rotten compromise. This led to the formation of the province of Manitoba, but in exchange for this provincial status and democratic government, Riel, he frankly gave up too much. The federal government retained ownership of land and resources and had only promised to respect Métis settlements and land rights, but Riel had no guarantees, and the federal government ended up using its ownership of the land to drive the Métis and indigenous peoples off their land. So it could move in settlers, it could build the railroad, and all those things. And so for decades, Canada's colony in the Northwest Territories, this is what Rupert's Land became known as, it remained underfunded, underdeveloped. The federal government is profiting off the sale of land and resource rights, but the colony just cannot afford to develop the infrastructure required to keep up with immigration and settlement. The colony couldn't raise taxes, it couldn't borrow money. It was completely dependent on subsidies from the federal government, and there was always massive budget shortfalls. Meanwhile, the federal government is making a mint off controlling land and resources. So there was eventually a fierce political struggle for provincial rights. toward the end of the 19th century. And this became intense enough that there were open calls for a revolt in the bourgeois press. There's an editorial in the Calgary Herald in 1904 declared that the federal government's treatment of the colony was quite sufficient to raise another rebellion. And this is referring to the Red River and Northwest uprisings led by Riel. And then when the Western provinces do finally get provincial status, they still weren't given the equal rights to the other provinces. The federal government maintained the control, the ownership of lands and natural resources. And the justification was that the prairie provinces owed the federal government and the other provinces for the costs of annexation and colonization, which they didn't want in the first place. And it was to pay for immigration, settlement, the expansion of the railroads, and so on. So this is one of the roots, the historical roots of Western alienation. So eventually the Northwest Territories was divided into the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Manitoba was expanded. And the Westerners had actually wanted one province, but the federal government under Laurier, they wanted two provinces to cut the political power of the territorial government. And they also didn't want a single Western province one day to become big enough that it could rival Ontario and Quebec. So the Western provinces wouldn't gain land and resource rights until 1930. And only when this was no longer profitable for the federal government. And even after they get the ownership of their land and resources, this didn't prevent significant encroachments by the federal government into provincial jurisdiction. So one of these, many people here will know, was the National Energy Program, the NEP, which is implemented by Pierre Trudeau's government in 1980. This is one of the very recent roots of Western alienation. And it is playing a role now directly in the separatist movements in Alberta. So basically Trudeau clamps on, there's an oil crisis, there's an economic crisis, he clamps on price controls and a series of duties and taxes. It makes Alberta, the Alberta oil barons cannot sell their oil at world market prices. They're forced to sell it at discount prices to the industries in Ontario and Quebec. So the NEP exposed this kind of perceived continuing colonial relationship between Ottawa and Alberta. So looking at Confederation, how it went down, looking at how each of the provinces joined, it's no wonder that the Canadian national consciousness is a little bit fragile. It's not rooted in a revolutionary consciousness. It's not rooted in a sweeping rise in national consciousness like you see in the United States, for example. I mean, outside of what is Ontario today, Confederation wasn't even all that popular. It wasn't popular because people were worried about a loss of identity, a fear of domination by the other provinces, a loss of local power, fears about inflation, taxation, and everything. And a vote on Confederation likely would have lost in most of the colonies. And not long after joining, Nova Scotia and BC, they asked to leave. PEI was forced to join because the economy had collapsed. They went to the British Empire, and the British said, well, we're not helping you, join Canada. So they did. Newfoundland, when it joined, it was divided right down the middle, and the western provinces were annexed and forced into Confederation. And then even when they joined as provinces, they were still second-class provinces. They didn't have the same rights as the others. So it's really incredible when you think about it that this doesn't really seem like an exercise in democratic nation building, but an exercise in building a nation through swindling. And so the peculiarities of the Canadian nation state are the result of this partial, distorted completion of the tasks of the bourgeois revolution. And this is why Canada can be a bit of a strange duck. And it's precisely because there never was this sweeping, thorough bourgeois democratic revolution that could clear all the remnants of Canada's semi-feudal, semi-colonial past. And so for the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution to be carried out fully, what needed to have happened was the revolutions of 1837-38 would have had to have been successful, and they would have had to have smashed the colonial system. They would have to sever all cords with the empire, like the Americans had. And this is why you get all these distortions in the Canadian Federation, but also because the Canadian bourgeois democratic nation state ends up developing under the domination of the British Empire. So there's all sorts of questions that haven't been resolved properly. The national question is an example. One could well imagine that the bourgeois democratic revolution in 1837, 1838 had been successful, that the national question in Quebec would likely have been solved either by some sort of voluntary union or a freely agreed upon separation. I can't really go into the national question of Quebec here in any detail. But it's also interesting that when you look at the Quiet Revolution, it becomes very clear that the bourgeoisie of Quebec, the petty bourgeoisie in Quebec, and the bourgeoisie in Canada, they are not going to solve the national question in Quebec. They've had hundreds of years to do it, and they haven't been. That task has now fallen to the proletariat, and that becomes very clear when you study the history of the Quiet Revolution, which wasn't really all that quiet anyway. But in the Quiet Revolution, at least some of the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution were carried out. There was separation of church and state. You have the modernization of state and civil society. And it wasn't something that was really solved by the Quiet Revolution per se, but agrarian reform wasn't completed in Quebec until 1970. That's the year that the final payments of the feudal dues under the seigneurial system were finally made. Democratic tasks still remain. We still have the British monarch as the head of state. Canada has an unelected Senate. The Indian Act is still in effect. There's a lot more that can be said about the problems of Confederation, the constitutional reforms of the 1980s and the betrayal of Quebec. There's been numerous battles about federal provincial jurisdiction, equalization payments, and so on. But many of these cracks in Confederation can be boiled down to one primary thing, and that's the national market. It's the establishment of a national market. This is really the fundamental task of the bourgeois democratic revolution. And it's this national market around which national consciousness is glued. And there is a national market in Canada, but it's highly fractured. It's highly provincialized. Almost all the fault lines in Confederation come down to the distortions in Canada's internal national market. In the early days of Confederation, the bourgeoisie in Ontario, Quebec, they had national ambitions. I mean, they were adding territory like crazy, but they were relatively small and weak. And they didn't have enough capital to extend their dominance and create this national cohesion. So generally what's happened historically is that the bourgeoisie in Ontario and Quebec, they've tended to use the federal government as a vehicle to impose domination. And it generally worked for much of Canadian history. But capitalism was constantly developing in the other provinces. And now you see some of the provinces like Alberta that are pushing back against this dominance of the ruling class in Ontario and Quebec. And a big part of Alberta separatism is about this. It's a struggle between the ruling class of Alberta to push back against the dominance of the ruling class in Ontario, Quebec, and to impose its own economic dominance. You know, there's been a lot of talk about breaking down interprovincial trade barriers. Carney has talked about legislation to create one Canadian economy out of 13, and there's actually a lot of truth to this. There is a national bourgeoisie. I'll get to that in a minute. I'm over time, but it's done soon, I promise. But look at the provincial wings of the Canadian ruling class. You've got the manufacturing wing, which is mostly Ontario and Quebec, and they aren't the same either. That should be made clear. But their reach doesn't extend very much beyond the borders. Think about aerospace in Quebec, automobile industry in Ontario. It doesn't really extend beyond those provinces. And it's the same for the other provinces. Resources and lumber in BC, oil in Alberta. It doesn't extend very much beyond the provincial borders. And these provincial economies are only very loosely connected to one another. And in fact, each province has closer economic ties with the United States than they do with any of the other provinces or country as a whole. And in fact, there was an article in the New York Times just the other day, and it was about provincial trade barriers affecting businesses in my hometown in Lloydminster. Could you believe it? Lloydminster made the New York Times. And it was incredible. It was like serendipity. I'm working on this, and I was like, wow, look at what we got here. So what it was about was this thing called Sandwich Gate in Lloydminster. So there was a sandwich shop on the Alberta side, and because it had meat in the sandwiches, they couldn't sell it in Saskatchewan. And so they were like, so I could put this thing in a cooler and drive to Grand Prairie, which is like 8 hours away, but I can't drive 2 minutes down the road and sell it. And there was just red tape everywhere. They couldn't get certification in Saskatchewan because to to sell meat cross-border, you need to have federal certification. So they looked into getting federal certification, and what they learned was that it was going to cost them $2 million to build a facility that would meet federal approval so that they could sell a fucking sandwich on the other side of the road in Lloydminster. And so when things like this, like all this red tape, all this extra money, most, small businesses and so on, they can't afford this. And you can see that this only benefits the big corporations. But even a big corporation, why are they going to spend $2 million to sell sandwiches across the street in Lloydminster? So these trade barriers just clog up the economy. And the provinces have something like a total of, I should make it clear, most of the interprovincial trade barriers are not tariffs. It's regulations, it's red tape, it's certifications, it's all this kind of stuff. The provinces have a combined total of some 600 professional credentialing bodies that regulate goods and services within their borders. So these barriers exist in virtually every industry. You've got health and safety rules in the different jurisdictions, so that throws up more barriers. There isn't a national health system, but a series of provincial health systems. They're not connected in any way. There's no sharing of health records, for example. I remember I grew up in Lloydminster. If you went to the doctor on the Alberta side, they had no idea what happened to you the last time on the Saskatchewan side. And by law, they could not share because of privacy rules. So yay. There's all these there's other regulations, right? You drive your truck, you get inspected. You're in BC, you get inspected. You cross the border into Alberta, you get inspected again. Why? Why is there not just one inspection? All this kind of stuff. So eventually what happened in Lloydminster is they contacted all these different levels of government, and everybody agreed to a pilot project. It's now been made permanent, and Lloydminster is now a free trade zone between Alberta and Saskatchewan. And so you can see that these barriers do act actually as a development. They act as a brake on the development of the productive forces. So anyway, Lloydminster now, the border city, it's this free trade zone. But this seems completely bonkers that in 2025, almost 160 years after Confederation, you're seeing free trade deals within Canada. This whole thing should have been resolved already with Confederation, with the establishment of the bourgeois nation state. And these trade barriers create ludicrous situations. There was that situation in New Brunswick a few years ago where the guy thought, I'll get cheap beer in Quebec. So he loaded up on beer in Quebec, drove back to New Brunswick, got busted by the Quebec provincial police, was fined, went to court, all these crazy things, right? And so what's absolutely crazy is that there are more barriers and restrictions to internal trade within Canada than there are within the European Union, which isn't even a country. And a few years ago, you had this thing called the War of the Roses. It was that brief trade war between Alberta and BC, which both had NDP governments. The BC government said, well, we don't like this bitumen thing on the coast and we want to investigate, so we're going to stop the import of bitumen from Alberta. So Rachel Notley lost her mind, and she said that the Alberta Gaming and Liquor Commission could no longer buy wine, purchase BC wine. And so now you have this completely bizarre situation where two provinces in the same country are in a trade war. You couldn't have something like this in the European Union, again, which isn't even a country. You have this completely bizarre situation. There's talk of a free trade agreement between the Atlantic provinces. Nova Scotia is working on free trade agreements with Alberta, BC, Manitoba, Ontario, and PEI. Ontario is working on free trade agreements with Alberta, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Obviously Canada is a bourgeois democratic nation state, but it doesn't really look like it sometimes. It's completely bizarre. So I did mention there is a national bourgeoisie, but it is actually pretty limited in size and scope. And the national bourgeoisie of any country has divisions between the industrial and the financial wings and so on. But it goes much, much deeper than that in Canada. The truly national bourgeoisie in Canada is really based in the banks and other financial institutions. And they're really the only wing of the bourgeoisie with a truly national scope. And historically, the federal government has represented this national bourgeoisie, but also the manufacturing bourgeoisie in Ontario and Quebec. And it's these interests that tend to become the primary national interests, pushed forward by the federal government. And it is often at the expense of the other provinces. And so Western alienation is partly rooted in this fact. The Western provinces, they tend to punch above their weight financially, but federal policies tend to favor Ontario and Quebec. There was this whole thing with the electric vehicles. This shows the problem. Ontario doesn't really have an electric vehicle industry, but the federal government wanted to foster one to help out their buddies in the ruling class in Ontario. So they pump a bunch of money into the EV industry. And then they slap tariffs on the Chinese EV industry to protect Ontario. Well, what does China do? Of course, they respond, but their response hits Saskatchewan industries in Saskatchewan. So Scott Moe turns around and he says, well, I'm just paying for a non-existent industry in Ontario. It's a Western Canadian expense to help something that doesn't even exist in Ontario. He's not wrong when he says that. And I believe, like, Scott Moe is a real bastard, but he's not wrong when he says stuff like that, right? And so the governments in the Western provinces are really frustrated because they see all this tax money flowing out to Central and Eastern Canada. The capitalists get pissed off, especially the oil barons, because they see their profits going off to subsidize other jurisdictions. This is equalization payments, that whole problem. And so these things are not easily resolved. I mean, Carney's talking about solving this with this bill that's supposed to pass here, but it goes so much deeper than just regulations. You have separate ruling classes, and and they're all kind of struggling for dominance on the federal scene. And so that's why this Team Canada approach, elbows up thing, that's why it was never going to work, because you got the biggest trade partner in the United States. And they're threatening all, tariffs and all these other things. So that forces all the provinces to start flying off in different directions to protect their own industries. Why do the Alberta oil barons care about what happens to manufacturing in Ontario? And why does the aerospace industry in Quebec care what happens in BC? So they're all going to move off and try to protect their own industries. And so these tensions within federation are increasing as the crisis of capitalism continues to unfold. And what it shows is that this economic basis of the Canadian nation is actually astonishingly weak. So this comes to Alberta separatism with Danielle Smith. They've launched this fight to assert their dominance and the dominance of the ruling class in Alberta. And you can see this in everything that Smith says. She's always complaining about the attacks on Alberta's industries from outside. She's constantly going on about Alberta's sovereignty and how it won't accept outside interference. But in her very next breath, she demands the right to determine policy in other jurisdictions. Nobody can tell Alberta what to do, but Alberta can tell BC that it must lift its tanker ban. Alberta can tell BC, Ontario, and Quebec that they must accept pipelines and so on. Alberta wants to determine how equalization payments work. And if the Alberta ruling class can't exert its dominance nationally, then it's possible that the province leaves. Now, there is the prospect of as well of Trump and American imperialism getting involved. Imagine what if Trump said, hey, if you guys vote to leave Canada, I'll take your CPP contributions, we'll bring them over to American Social Security, dollar for dollar, and you can become the first 51st state. That could actually have a pretty big impact on the vote, right? And just imagine, this isn't the perspective necessarily, but just imagine that, okay, Alberta's going to join the 51st state. It's going to join the United States as the 51st state. Well, how long is it going to be before Saskatchewan starts to think, that's maybe a good idea? And then Manitoba, 84% of Manitoba's exports are pharmaceuticals to the United States. How long before Manitoba starts thinking, So it's possible, I'm not saying this is a perspective, but it is possible that Canadian Confederation will just collapse like a house of cards if things go a certain way. So that's not the perspective, but it is at least a potential that one has to consider. So you see all these things, the problems of Confederation, the problems of the national market, the problems of the national question, democratic questions like the monarchy and the Senate. These things are not going to be resolved by the bourgeoisie. They haven't resolved any of them in hundreds of years. These things will have to be resolved by the working class. And this means fighting against the capitalists and their interests. It means fighting for nationalization and workers' control. And that's how these problems will be solved. Nationalization of the main levers of the economy to truly serve local and nationwide interests. A genuine workers' democracy that allows local communities a direct say in their economic and political future in a genuine democratic coordination with regional and national governments. And it's not the task of the working class to solve the problems of Confederation for the capitalists, to make it work better for them. The only way to resolve these problems is to overthrow the entire system. And so that's the historic task of the working class, is to overthrow capitalism. And the Constitution and the Confederation of Canada, they won't survive the socialist transformation of society. The revolutionary struggle of the working class to change society will not be successful if it remains within the legal confines of the society that is trying to overthrow. And that's why we can't support these union campaigns. They're trying to work with the bosses, be a part of Team Canada, make capitalism better for the bosses. I mean, this is completely ludicrous. So what is needed is the socialist transformation of Canada. And the problems of Confederation, of the national economy, will be resolved through the genuine union of the working class, and it will be resolved in the socialist future of Canada.